perfect in all their actions. If you will have that precision out of them and make their fingers measure degrees like cogwheels, and their arms make curves like compasses, you must of necessity unhumanize them. All their strength and attention must go into the accomplishment of some narrow goal, so that in due and inevitable course, both soul and sight are worn away and the human being is lost. And at our time in history, it is verily the degradation of the operative into a machine, which more than any other evil of the times is leading those so treated everywhere into vain, incoherent, destructive struggling for a freedom they cannot explain the nature of even to themselves. Their universal outcry, their rage against wealth, against nobility, is not forced from them by pressure of famine. It is not that they are ill-fed, but they have no pleasure in the work by which they make their bread. They feel that the kind of labor to which they are condemned is a degrading one and makes them less than men. Quite literally, they feel their souls withering within them, unthanked, find their whole being sunk into an unrecognized abyss, to be counted off into a heap of mechanism, numbered with its wheels and weighed by its hammer strokes. This nature bade not. This God blesses not. This humanity for no long time is able to endure. And the great cry that rises from our manufacturing cities, louder than the furnace blast, is all in very deed for this, that we manufacture everything there but men. We blanch cotton and strengthen steel and refine sugar and shape pottery, but to brighten, to strengthen, to refine, or form a single living human spirit never enters into our estimate of advantages. And the solution can only come about by a right understanding on the part of all classes of what kinds of labor are good for men, raising them and making them happy, and by determined sacrifice of such convenience or beauty or cheapness as is to be got only by the degradation of others, and by an equally determined demand for the products and results of healthy and ennobling labor. So wrote John Ruskin in 1853 in his wonderful book, The Stones of Venice, which I will talk about in a minute or two. I want to go back and just share with you one more time that last little bit, because today what we're talking about is the connection of Ruskin to the arts and crafts movement. My fundamental argument today, other than to tell you something about Ruskin, if you don't know very much about him, I hope you will find what I have to say interesting, at least. My fundamental point today is to try to make the argument that Ruskin is indeed the progenitor of the arts and crafts movement. It's basically forgotten, too bad, but hopefully we'll begin to get the word out that that's the case. Everybody knows about William Morris. Everybody knows about Elbert Hubbard at Roycroft. Everybody knows about the many successful arts and crafts movements in the UK and the US and Australia and other places, but very few know the critical role that Ruskin played in the formation of it. So I want to show you some of that today in the time that we have ahead of us. This is one of my favorites, a marvelous portrait of Ruskin done by the pre-Raphaelite painter John Everett Millais. It's now at the Ashmolean at Oxford, and it is just a stunning portrait to me because it shows more than many other, even the photographs, many photographs of Ruskin do. It shows the dignity of the man, the nobility of the man, in a way the heart and soul of the man. So I want to give you a sense of him as a person. He was not the first to raise his voice against the juggernaut that we now call the Industrial Revolution and its indignities visited in all the people who work for it. Well, most of them, not the richest ones at the very top, of course. but all the people who worked for it. His cry against their dehumanization, you have just heard. His anger at this degradation of other human beings, you have just heard. And I'll read you again for the moment, just that last little bit that I read you a moment ago, because I want you to hear in it that concern for the good of all humanity. Ruskin came from the upper middle class, or the very lower upper class. His father was a very rich sherry merchant in England. So he had all the privileges of a life of where there was never any want of money himself. But his fundamental identification was with working people, and in fact, all people. And I'm going to show you more of this as we go on. But I'm going back to that last sentence because, as I say, the kernel of the entire arts and crafts movement is in it. Ruskin wrote, and the solution to all these difficulties, he means, can only come about by a right understanding on the part of all classes of what kinds of labor are good for men, raising them and making them happy, and by determined sacrifice of such convenience or beauty or cheapness as to be got only by the degradation of them, and by an equally determined demand for the products and results of healthy and ennobling labor. That's what the arts and crafts are, to me, really all about. A kind of work that makes human beings happy, and it is fundamentally healthy and ennobling labor. So Ruskin, in the middle of the 19th century, my goodness, had we lived then, we would have known that he was as famous as Dickens, as famous as Disraeli, as famous as Prime Minister Gladstone, as famous as the great writer George Eliot. Whenever Ruskin spoke, and he did often, he was brought to various cities to give talks of one sort or another. He was the first Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford beginning in 1869. And his lectures were so mesmerizing that he often had to give them 2 and 3 times because the overflow crowds were so great. Ruskin was incredibly famous. Here's back to that picture to give you a sense of it, done at by Millais in 1874, when Ruskin had just published the Stones of Venice. And here is one of his admirers. This is Charlotte Bronte, the wonderful author of one of the first great books about women trying to find a way for women to be in less subservient positions, called Jane Eyre. Had great fame because of that, as did her sister, for Wuthering Heights and other books of the time. Anyway, she read Ruskin. Ruskin first became famous with a series of books he called Modern Painters. And the heart of Modern Painters was to tell people what art was, why it was important in human life, and why, when we learned to see it properly, we became better human beings. So she read Modern Painters, and here's what she said at the end of her reading of the second volume of Modern Painters. I think it's one of the great little bits about Ruskin. Many people would have did write, in fact, similar things. So she said in a letter to a friend in 1853, I have lately been reading Modern Painters, and I have derived from the work much genuine pleasure. Hitherto, I had only instinct to guide me in the judging of art and the viewing of nature. I feel now as if I had been walking blindfold. The book seems to give me eyes. That's a wonderful statement about Ruskin's power of talk, which you've just heard a moment ago. On the left, we have 60 years later, an image of Virginia Woolf. Everybody knows of Virginia Woolf's wonderful, wonderful novels and poems and essays and so on. And in one of her essays nearing the end of her life, she said this about Ruskin. 60 years later, she says, we find that the style in which page after page of modern painters is written takes our breath away. We find ourselves marveling at the words. as if all the fountains of the English language have been set playing in the sunlight for our pleasure. Now, that's a pretty terrific line and a pretty terrific praise. The fellow on the right, his name is William Harcourt, Sir William Harcourt. He was Chancellor of the Home Secretary for a time and Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he wrote this in a letter to a friend in 1853. Have you read the second volume of Ruskin's Stones of Venice yet? If you have not, beg, borrow, or steal it. It is one of the finest things that was ever written, full of inspiring eloquence and genuine genius. It recreates Venice. And one felt in reading it not only as if one was there again, but saw much more than is revealed to ordinary eyes. You will be in ecstasies at the glorious descriptions of St. Mark's Basilica. That's how famous Ruskin was and how much he impressed the people who read his books and took them time and time again. You know, he mentions the Stones of Venice, and I will come back to it again in just a moment in more detail. But one of the wonderful things about the book, The Stones of Venice, is that for at least until 1900, perhaps even a little later, people could be seen walking around Venice carrying the Stones of Venice and going into church after church, finding painting after painting, looking at this bridge, looking at that building with Ruskin's book in hand. He really recreated Venice, as Harcourt says, he really recreated Venice as a world stopping point. So that's how significant he was at the time. I want to show you because we're thinking about the arts and crafts here. Now we're thinking this is 1853. Here is the cover of the first edition of the Stones of Venice. And since most of the people who are listening today are arts and crafts people, I want you to have a little bit of a look at it with me. I want you to see what an incredibly and beautifully and finely crafted thing this book cover is. We have, it's all made of, the whole cover is made of fine leather. We have at the top circling the central motif in the middle, we have wonderful vine leaves. We have in the center a pointed arch. And of course, if you've ever been to Venice, you know that many pointed arches are there. And we have the symbols of Venice, which are the peacocks in the middle of it, which Ruskin will be talking about these symbols throughout his book. But I want you to see this not only as a beautiful book, and Ruskin all his life believed that books should be beautiful. He said they should never be made cheaply. They should never be sold for anything less than it would cost the person who made the book to make their money back. They are invaluable tools of our own human enlightenment. But looking at that book again, we see that at least 3 or 4, maybe 5 different people have been involved in the creation of that cover alone. It put people to work, doing wonderful things, making the vines, making the peacocks, putting it in gold, making it all work on the leather that he had chosen for it. It is a piece, an early image of an arts and crafts creation, in my view, 1853. So I want to take you to Venice with Ruskin in a moment, but I want to give you first his definition of architecture, which I don't know where all of you are in terms of reading about architecture. This comes from the 7 Lamps of Architecture, which he published 2 or 3 years before the Stones of Venice. It is by you know, if you've never read and you like architecture, if you have never read the 7 Lamps of Architecture, I cannot recommend anything more strongly. It is still, in my mind, the greatest book that's ever been written about architecture. But here's a little bit of why. Here's his definition of architecture. Architecture is the art which so disposes and adorns the edifices raised by human beings for whatsoever uses, that the sight of them contributes to their mental health, power, and pleasure. Now that is a terrific definition, but it is also one that, as you can see, says nothing about things like functionality. It doesn't matter what building you're making. It might be a church. It might be a government building. It might be a school. It might be a stadium. It might be a house. whatever they are, go ahead. You need those things, so build them. But make them incredibly glorious and beautiful evocations of the human spirit, so that when people encounter them, not only the people who live in them, but the people who visit them and the people who walk by them on the street will have their mental health, power, and pleasure enhanced. So that a house, a school, a government building are in fact intended, and that's what makes us the happiest when we're in them or seeing them, to raise us higher in life. Yeah, so it's a great definition. Ruskin understands that any architect will know how to put up a wall so it won't fall down. He understands that any architect will be able to cut a window and make a door. Those are not the critical things. So they should be made and made beautifully, but those things are not what a building is for. It's to delight you. And so we have, of course, as many of you know, you have been there. If you have not been there, you must go there, because it is so, and take the Stones of Venice with you. It is such a glorious place to spend as much time as you can allot to it. This is Venice. This is the main entry into the Piazza San Marco. And on the right, of course, you have the Ducal Palace, which is one of the greatest buildings in the world. Ruskin said that the Piazza San Marco, the Church of San Marco, and the Ducal Palace, which you see here prominently on the right, were the central buildings of the world. They were that important. They were so wonderfully arranged and made so that human beings would always delight in them. I'm going to share with you another passage of Ruskin's. This is, of course, the view of San Marco, the Basilica San Marco at the end of the long entryway into it, which I'll talk about in a moment. On the right, you have the Campanile, not fully displayed, but you have it during one of my trips there a number of years back. This is early in the morning. If you went at our time, maybe not at Peter's UK time or other people on the West Coast at their time, you would find it full of not millions, but tens of thousands of people, quite literally. Venice, until of late, of course, Venice gets 30 million visitors a year, and they all go there to have their picture or their selfie taken there. But Ruskin was there much earlier. He was there in the 1800s, first probably visited there probably in 1838, 39, something of that nature, and then later on came to write the Stones of Venice. So here's a passage about what you are looking at from the Stones of Venice. It takes the reader from the entryway directly to the west, and we're looking directly east at the Basilica San Marco, and brings them through certain narrow valleys. If you've been there, you know that he's right about this. The alleys are narrow, they're tall, they're higgledy-piggledy on one side or the other, and then suddenly you go through a little entryway, not very distinguished all by itself. It's called the Bocca di Piazza, the mouth of the piazza, and then his description begins. We will push through these alleys, finally into the shadow of the pillars at the end of the Bocca di Piazza, and then we forget them all. This is a Canaletto painting of done in around 1710, I think. And then we forget them all, for between those pillars there opens a great light, and in the midst of it, the vast tower of St. Mark's seems to lift itself visibly forth from the level field of checkered stones, and on each side the countless arches of the colonnade of the Procreati Vecchie, there on both sides of the image that you're looking at, prolong themselves into a ranged symmetry, as if the rugged and irregular houses that pressed together above us in the dark alley have been struck back into sudden obedience and lovely order, and all their rude casements and broken walls have been transformed into arches charged with goodly fluted shafts of delicate stone. So I want you to think, as I give you a little bit more of this, if this is the San Marco that those 30 million see, if this is the San Marco that you saw the last time I was there, I didn't go to San Marco and see it properly till I took this passage with me. And well may we fall back. For beyond those troops of ordered arches, there arises a vision out of the earth, a multitude of arches and white domes clustered into a long, low pyramid of colored light, a treasure heap, it seems, partly of gold and partly of marble and partly of mother of pearl, hollowed beneath into great vaulted porches, clear as amber and delicate as ivory, sculpture fantastic and involved of palm leaves and lilies and grapes and pomegranates and birds clinging and fluttering among the branches, all twined together into an endless network of buds and plumes. And in the midst of it, the solemn forms of angels, sceptered and robed to their feet and leaning to each other across the gates, their figures indistinct among the gleaming of the golden ground through the leaves beside them, like the morning light as it faded back among the branches of Eden when its first gates were angel guarded so long ago. And around the walls of the porches, there are set pillars of variegated stones, jasper and porphyry and deep green serpentine, spotted with flakes of snow, and marbles that half refuse and half yield to the sunshine. Line after line of azure and undulation as a receding tide leaves the wave sand. Their capitals, rich with interwoven tracery, knotted roots of herbage, and drifting leaves of acanthus and vine. And above them, in the broad archivolts, a continuous chain of language and life, angels, the signs of heaven, the labors of men, each in its appointed season upon the earth. And above these, another range of glittering pinnacles, mixed with white arches edged with flowers, and the St. Mark's lion lifted on a blue field covered with stars, until at last, as if in ecstasy, the crests of the arches break into marble foam and toss themselves far into the blue sky in flashes and wreaths of sculptured spray, as if the breakers on the Lido shore had been frostbound before them, and the sea nymphs had inlaid them with coral and amethyst. I don't know how many times I've read that, but it's always thrilling. I mean, William Harcourt said the power of Ruskin talking about San Marco was just unspeakable. And there you have one of the great examples of it. And I submit that, like, if you were like me, when I certainly first came, and I went, of course, as does everybody, to San Marco to have my picture there. Here are some of the tens of thousands of tourists on that particular day. I didn't see what I just read. I saw this and, sent home the pictures as everybody and so on. Charlotte Bronte said, Ruskin taught me to see, and William Harcourt said the same, and Virginia Woolf said the same. It is one of the most glorious buildings in the world. And across the way, if you happen to be in Venice at the Piazza San Marco, if you look across the way to the south, you will see on the other side of the lagoon another great piece of Renaissance architecture. The Basilica San Marco is definitely not Renaissance architecture, which I'll come back to in a moment. You will see the beautiful San Giorgio Maggiore, built by Andrea Palladio in the 1600s, 500 years after the Basilica San Marco. And there it is. And if you look along the waterline, you notice something that's really interesting, and it has certainly been my experience every time I have been in Venice. There are no people there. It's just a mile across the lagoon. You can get a vaporetto that takes you there in a few minutes. There are no people there. And here it is in closer view, and there are no people there. And the reason is because it's a very different kind of church. And the point that I want to make here, and tie to what I was saying a little bit before, is that this church, it's a very beautiful church. It's a high Renaissance church. And Palladio has other examples of very beautiful churches in Venice and other places as well. But the difference between this And the difference between this and that, between this and that, is palpable. This is the vision of one man. All the people who worked for Palladio did what he told them to do. All of them building it. Of course, it's really kind of an imitation, is it not, of classical Greek architecture. He made up what needed to be done, where things were going to be, what was going to happen, etc. There were, of course, probably hundreds of workers who went to work on this building. But unlike the winemakers on San Marco, these fellows had to do exactly what they were told to do. Their creativity was not respected. Their human life and the chance to be happy was not respected. But San Marco was made by thousands of hands over hundreds of years. I didn't show you this one before. It's beautiful. It's inside one of the three main arches, and most people miss it. But if you look at it, you see that there must have been, look at the arch figures that are beginning on the left-hand side there. They're all different. They're all doing different things in life. They were all made by different sculptors, and then you move into the next inner arch, and then the next inner arch after that. And it's just a celebration of these people's lives. And San Marco, Maggiore is not. It's a celebration of one man's great vision. This is the shift from the Renaissance, where the Renaissance went after the Middle Ages, after the time of Gothic art, which is of course what the Basilica San Marco fundamentally is. The vision shifts to one person. We're still there, folks, at least as far as I know. Our great buildings are built by famous architects. They're absolutely competent. They have good vision. Some of the buildings are really quite thrilling, but they are not built with their workers fundamentally in mind. They are built with the vision of the architect in mind. That's the change. One man who saw all of this as he read the Stones of Venice was somebody that Ruskin knew well. He was about 25 years younger than Ruskin. It was William Morris. And he read what Ruskin had to say, and he was transformed by it. Morris said his, meaning Ruskin's words, seemed to point out a new road on which the world should travel if we wish to find our way out of the folly and degradation of civilization. For the lesson Ruskin teaches us is that art is the expression of man's pleasure in labor, that it is possible for man to rejoice in his work, and that unless that work once again becomes a pleasure to him, he must toil in pain. He must toil in pain and therefore live in pain. So two things from this, many things likely, but two things in particular. Morris sees Ruskin's humane vision. Morris sees Ruskin's love of the creative spirit that's in everybody. And he also sees that you set that spirit loose and wonderful things happen. Whereas if you don't, not very good things happen. You may get a wonderful building like San Giorgio Maggiore, but you get a whole bunch of workers who at the end of their day are very deeply glad their day is over, go home and whatever they did in those days, watch too much, drink too much, and are bored with their lives instead of delighted with them. That's the difference. So Morris loved Ruskin's work so much, he started his own press and many other things, which we'll come back to a little bit later. But he started his own press called the Kelmscott Press in England, in the southern part of England. And he published Ruskin's Nature of Gothic, which is the 8th chapter in the middle of the 2nd volume of the Stones of Venice. And he thought it was such a wonderful evocation of the creative spirit of humanity. He published it, and he recreated the images that you saw in the cover of the first volume of the Stones of Venice a little long ago. Look at these wonderful designs. Look at these little wonderful floral designs. These are just terrific. And this is now, I think, an extremely rare book. I was going to suggest it if anybody out there finds a copy of it and would sell it to me for, let's say, $60 or $70, you would find a buyer. So this begins, however, Morris is the one who really begins the arts and crafts as a movement. Ruskin advocates treating every human being as a creative person, making every human being have a chance to express their soul in their work. He begins with the ideas. Morris takes the ideas and begins to put them in operation. And then it's the second major step in the recreation of the arts and crafts. I want to make Ruskin's point just a couple more times. Here's the Rouen of our title. This is Rwan Cathedral, about 200 miles, probably slightly northwest of Venice, also of the same medieval time. And this is, of course, great Gothic architecture. And it's just, again, if you've not been there, please do put it on a list and go and spend. You can spend easily days just looking at this facade. It's like we have festoons of soft marble drifting down from the top here, done by, again, hundreds of people, over hundreds of people. But I don't want to spend a long time on this. I want to take you around the corner. I want to take you, that's the west front, the one that you just saw. This is now on the north porch. This is the entry into the cathedral from the north. And this, to me, was one of the most breathtaking architectural sites I had ever seen. It's just transportive. It lifts you out of your shoes into the beauty of the work that has been done by all of these folks. And this is, remember, this is not the principal entry into the cathedral. It's on a side porch. And here, as you go further into it, you find on the walls arranged sort of like the Procreate Vecchia in Piazza San Marco. These are slanted tile walls that lead into that main door. And if you look a little bit carefully, one of the things you see is that the tiles are all different kinds of carving. You can't make them out until you go a little closer still, as did my friend and colleague Cynthia Gamble, who's a British Ruskin person. We traveled with a group of others to the northern parts of France a couple of years ago, well, no, probably 10 years ago now, and we were particularly in search of a particular tile. And you see, we have found it. We went through, there are 300 tiles on that wall, and we went through and we found it because Ruskin taught us about it. And there's the tile in close-up, and I want you to look in particular at the little fellow on the lower left, because Ruskin wrote a wonderful bit about this little fellow. But first, look at the hole. There's a dragon in the top corner. There's something, a man having fallen down in the lower right-hand corner. There's another creature on the upper right. There's in the centerpiece some kind of ogre or creature being conquered by somebody. And if you went to the tile next to it, you would find a different story being told, probably by a different sculptor. And so that tile wall that we saw a moment ago is the creation, again, of hundreds of different people as they went through their sculpting lives. At the Huntington Library, outside of Los Angeles, is the manuscript of the 7 Lamps of Architecture. And in it, we find this drawing. This is Ruskin's, that's Ruskin's handwriting at the very bottom. And he is going to tell us in one of the chapters, it's called the Lamp of Life. He's going to tell us about the creatures in the top left and the lower right who are taken, his drawings are taken from the wall, the tile wall that I just showed you. And he wants to make the point that I've been making all along here about the importance of the workman and the workman's joy and creativity as they do their work in this world. So first, let's take that little dragon on the top. And here's what Ruskin has to say about him. He says, while there is nothing particularly special about the design of the quatrefoil in which the dragon-like figure on the upper left lived, nothing exemplary in the marvelously skilled, nonetheless, carving of the wings and the scales of the creature, there is something extremely special that emerges when you look at the figure closely. There are, in the features of thoughtfulness and fancy which have been rendered in the carving, something which is not common, at least nowadays. This creature is biting something, the form of which is hardly traceable in the defaced stone, but biting he is. And the reader cannot but recognize in the peculiarly reverted eye an expression which is never seen, as I think, but in the eye of a dog gnawing something in jest and preparing to start away with it. That dragon is then in that sculptor's house, that bad dog Spike who never does what you tell him to do. And he delighted, that sculptor, in making this image of that bad dog Spike. And that bad dog Spike and that sculptor live 700 and more years later because of the fineness of his work that you would never find in San Giorgio Maggiore. Now let's look at the little fellow. Let's look at this fellow whom Ruskin calls the little man. And here's what he writes about him. The meaning of the dragon's glance, so far as it can be marked by the incision of a chisel, can be felt by comparing it with the eye of the couchant figure on the right in its gloomy and angry brooding. The plan of this head and the nod of the cap over its brow are fine, but there is a little touch above the hand, which is especially well meant. This fellow is vexed and puzzled in his malice, and his hand is pressed hard on his cheekbone, and the flesh of the cheek, and Ruskin underlines the next word, and the flesh of the cheek is wrinkled under the eye by the pressure. The whole, which indeed looks coarse when it is seen on a scale, when it is naturally compared with delicate figure etchings, is a mere filling on an interstice on the outside of one cathedral gate, and is one of more than 300 similarly carved creatures. It proves, this little fellow, the vital nobility of the art and architecture of the time. So what Ruskin wants us to see in the dragon and the little man. Who is the little man? We don't know. I like to think he's Uncle Pierre, who used to come to dinner every Sunday at the sculptor's house and was always cranky or complaining about something. And that's who he put in his stone. And there he is 700 years later, still cranky. And one other thing to mention with this little guy, right? That sculptor, knowing where his own tile was, by the end of his life, when he was a grandfather and no longer working every day, could take his grandson and his granddaughter to the cathedral tile wall and say, look, I did that one, and I did that one. Those are my creations. He delighted in the work he was allowed to do. And so now Ruskin's last sentence in that passage where he's talking about the dragon and the little man, he says, and so I believe this is to me the heart, or the first real statement of what are the arts and crafts. And so I believe the right question to ask, respecting all ornament on our buildings, is simply this: was it done with enjoyment? Was the worker happy when he was about it? It may be the hardest work possible, and harder because so much pleasure was taken in it, but it must have been happy too, or it will not be living. So the life force of the person, the worker, goes into the work, and then the work becomes alive because the life force of the person is in it. Again, rethink San Giorgio Maggiore on the other side of the lagoon from Basilica San Marco. Here's another figure from Ruskin's Seven Lamps of Architecture, and he means it to show us the various orders of the arches that were created during the High Middle Ages, the lower or the early part of the Middle Ages going to the higher part of the Middle Ages. And what we see here is three different models. And aren't they just terrific? And weren't the people who made the first ones really delighted they were able to do that, and note that the three upper images are all different. And then came the people in the middle images, and weren't they much more exciting? And then finally we have the ones in the top, and these are just delightful. All of these people were allowed. They're building a cathedral, of course, so it has to have certain things in common with other cathedrals, but they're all allowed to use their own creativity in the doing of it. That's the heart of the arts and crafts. Here's Ruskin from a little bit from the Two Paths, a series of lectures. If you're art people and architecture people, you will love the Two Paths. The talk was called The Unity of Art in 1859. He says, without mingling the heart passions with hand power, no art is possible. The highest art unites both in their intensest degrees, the action of the hand at its finest with that of the heart at its fullest. Before the houses were Gothic, sorry, the cathedrals were Gothic, Ruskin said, the houses were Gothic. And here, this is in the little town of Ambeville, where I'm going to take you again in another moment, outside of Amiens, where there's another enormous and wonderful cathedral. This was done by a fellow by the name of Thomas Rook, who traveled with Ruskin on the continent a number of times. But this is just somebody's house. And they have taken the time and the energy and hired somebody, or perhaps even done it themselves if the person living there was a sculptor, to make it beautiful. It's their house. So here's the message of Ruskin's. Ruskin loved Gothic, but here's the message of Ruskin's love of Gothic. He loved Gothic not because it was an entertaining style. He loved it because it was a way that human beings could be delighted in their work, as William Morse said in his lovely passage. Gothic begins inside of each of us, in this person's house. Here's the Turkish merchant's house in Venice. Another one. All of these buildings are different from one another. Look, they could have made it like San Giorgio Maggiore and had everything basically the same and in perfect symmetry, but they didn't, because it wasn't as much fun to make it that way. They made it this way. Here in Venice, also in Venice, one of my favorite little corners, if you get off the Vaporato at the stop that leaves you at the Piazza San Barnaba, on the corner there's this little palazzo, not a great palazzo, a little palazzo. And if you go get off the Vap at night and you look and it's lit from the inside, look at this little piece of delight. Isn't it terrific? It's not in any of the guidebooks. You're not directed to go and have a look at this one. But there it is, the delight of the people who live there to create this, different pillars, different capitals, lovely arches inside protecting windows, etc. This is Gothic architecture. This is the language of life, Ruskin says. And here I have to show you this one because we were in Venice back in 1994. I was teaching for the first time there, and there's a small building on the Zattere that is a lovely place where Ruskin stayed when he lived in Venice one time. And he stayed in if you look at the three windows that my daughter, who was she was then 8 years old, drew on the right-hand side, the one on the right-hand side, that's where Ruskin's rooms were because he had the best view from there. So it's called La Calcina. This is all my daughter's writing. John Ruskin lived and worked in this house. And on the left, she has written at the top, "We lived here," by Lauren, "I love Dad." I love that piece. But the reason that I included for you to have a look at it, it's not great art, but it is the beginning of great art. Because that is Lauren's soul on that piece of paper, and what she felt and what delighted her at the time. So I want you to see that, as Ruskin wants us to see, that great art comes when the head, the heart, and the hand are together, and never comes when they're not present. If you're art historians and you've taken courses in it, as I did long ago, you're told, well, first came the Byzantine, and then came the Gothic, and then came the Renaissance, low and high, and then came the Baroque, and then came modern art, or whatever followed the Baroque. and became modern art, and now we are a postmodern art, etc. And that's the story. No, Ruskin says, that is not the story. This is the story. This is a building that lives 700 years after it was created. And that's what we have to see. And that's what the arts and crafts are all about. This is just a corner of one of these wonderful, these little cathedrals that that nobody visits, really. This is Saint-Xavier in the northern part of France, and Ruskin, of course, visited them all. And look at the astonishingly beautiful work that the people who made this church decided to put on just this one corner. That is the great truth that Ruskin teaches. Gothic is not a style. Gothic is life. Your house is an expression of your life. Your walls, whatever hangs on them, are an expression of your life. They're not corporate things. They're yours. We love and admire the things that we keep around us because they express our life, the things that are important to us, that give us joy. Why shouldn't all work be like this? Fine art only appears when the hand, the head, and the heart go together. So one more place with Ruskin, and then I'll bring it to our side of the ocean. This is the town of Ambeville in the northern part of France, in Picardy. It's just not too far south of Amiens, which I mentioned before. Ruskin was there in 1845, and boy, if I could get this drawing, I'd like it. And he painted's the wrong word. He drew the town square. It's one of the most, you can see what a talented hand he had. It's one of the most beautiful Ruskin drawings of all, and there are really a great many of them, of the town square. And what I want you to see, and what he wants us to see as people look at his drawing, is how these buildings, yes, they're all built of a style, of a time, but they're all different from one another. They all house different people, butchers and bakers and candlestick makers and people who kept the horse stables and people who sold the meats and whatever. And they all did slightly different things, sometimes radically different things with their houses. And so the town square is a delight to see. And behind it, we see the little cathedral. It's not a very big one. Called St. Wulfran, which Ruskin also loved as well. So I want you to look at the town, and I want you to look at St. Wulfran with me for a moment. Small, out of the way. We're not going to Paris here. We're not going to Amiens here. We're not going to Lyon here. We're going to a little out of the way place. Here's their church. Here's their small cathedral. Look at the glorious work that's here. Look at it more carefully, going around to the side, to the side. And this is just a side view. Well, they could have made it all the same, but they didn't. They made it all different. And it's a delight to have a look at as you go around. You're never bored when you're there. Now, let's go back to one of those arches you saw a moment ago and take a little closer look at it. Isn't this a terrific arch? Look at the everything that's being done in this upper part of the arch. There's a figure on the the left whose face is worn away with time. But you go inside the arch and you see that all of these carvings are just delightful. They tell a story. I don't want to share it. Well, for time, we won't share the story today. But this is a wonderful thing. This is not an image. This central figure is not anything you saw anywhere in San Marco, anything you saw in Rouen. It's something of the life force of these folks. Here's Ruskin's drawing of one of those arches. I just delight in this one. I think it's so exciting. Look at the work that's being done there by all these different artisans. Here's something a little closer, gives you a sense of this. This, again, it's sort of like the entryway to that north porch in Rouen here. This is just the expression of the people who live there. Look at these wonderful, wonderful curly-Q vines and roots above the main arch. Look at how they come together. Look how they're all different from one another, how it is just a thrilling experience to look at this. Ruskin is trying to teach us this so we will understand to use head, heart, and mind and head, heart, and hand in the work that we do in life. So here again, the town square, the people of the time, 1845. You know why we know this is great art? Because we pay to go and see it. Our credit cards do the talking for us, or did for a time, because we want to go and see that which we do not have ourselves, we who live on this side, the western side of the Atlantic. Here's the town square in Ambeville from a picture I just found yesterday on the web, 1984. Sorry, 1944, 100 years after Ruskin. Looks the same, right? St. Wulfrun in the back, looks beautiful. Here's the town square in Ambeville as it looks today. Early in 1944, it looked like this. And then came the great Allied bombing, trying to bring the Great War to an end in Ambeville. And all of it was destroyed. Not the cathedral, although the back half of the cathedral was destroyed. And this is what it looks like today. Now, we can't lament that they had to rebuild it. We can't lament that aspect of it. But we can lament what they put in its place. Gothic is gone. The head, the heart, and the hand are gone. We have routine buildings in the place. Here's the town center, the town hall. Well, it's kind of interesting, but it's really boring. There's been a shift in just that 100 years, or really more 100 years than that, since this. So that's modern architecture. Now, I want to take you now to my side, our side of most people's side of the Atlantic Ocean who are tuned into this talk here. And I want to take you to where Peebles reigns. I live in Geneva, New York. We like to call it the other Geneva. And we, like you, probably wherever you are in this large and wide North America, have a shopping center nearby. And the anchor store in our shopping center is Peebles. And I just want you to have a look at the architecture here. It's more like the San Giorgio, don't you think, than the Basilica San Marco? Think about the workers who constructed this building. Boy, they must have been really, really excited about putting in those arches, or those lack of arches there. Down the road just a bit, in the shopping center, we have Value Hardware. They have trouble with spelling, as you can see, at Value Hardware. And it's, again, an exciting piece of architecture. Across the street, we have Rite Aid, our pharmacy, with, of course, more problems with spelling in our little town. And here, from up above, of course, is the view of the town and plaza, so town and country plaza, as we call it, which is not quite like the Piazza San Marco or the town square in Ambeville. Another point, to not allow creativity in the people who work on our buildings and do our artwork for us, Ruskin says, destroys the soul of the people who are doing the work. But there's a second level to that. It destroys our delight in their work. The grandfather sculptor could take his grandchildren to his place and say, look, I did that little man, that's Uncle Pierre. Yeah, nobody's bringing their grandchildren to this plaza to show them how delightful their work is. This is all rote work. This is all boring work. The workers are dull, and we are dulled because of what we see. So I don't want you to think that my town, Geneva, in upstate New York, is just a provincial backwater in terms of the buildings that we have here that we use every day. I want to take you across the continent. I want to take you to Cupertino in California, the heart of the Apple Corporation. Here's their central building here, and we're going out to have a little visit there, and we have to go afterwards to a pharmacy, and we go to Rite Aid. which of course looks exactly like the Rite Aid in my town, 3,000 miles away, and they still have problems spelling. Yes, well, now we want to get some clothes. So we decide to go to Sears. Well, now Sears and we're really talking about an exciting building to go in and go and spend our money in, aren't we? Isn't this a wonderful piece of architecture? Well, they've thought about it a little bit. So what they've done is that they put a nice little bubbling fountain inside where we can sit as we go and buy things at the various arms down the center of the shopping center, and it will entertain us because people like moving water and things like that. But of course, if we were in Rome and wanted to go to a fountain, we might go to one called Trevi. And at Trevi Fountain, we would find this and this. These were done by people who allowed their workers, yes, to just delight in what they were doing. That's a real horse. That's a real Titan blowing his wreathed horn. It's fantastic. We go to Rome to see these things because we don't have them, because we have lost the vision. Back to Geneva. We have a cinema in our parking lot. Look what wonderful things we can go to see on this particular day. A film called Conjuring. Another one, another spelling problem, ripped in 2D and 3D. We can make a choice. Grown-ups, 2D. That's supposed to be a D at the end of it. Turbo, Despicable Me, Red, Heat, and Pacific Rim. Well, we know something about the Pacific Rim from a moment ago. Talk about edifying films. So the point is that there's been this shift, and Ruskin writes about this shift in his works on political economy, which came after his works on art and architecture. Wrote a great book in 1860 called Unto This Last, which is essentially a direct attack on the corrupting effects of modern economic life. I give other talks about that. But anyway, he writes in a lecture he gave at Bradford in 1864, a lecture he calls Bradford. It's one of the greatest lectures ever delivered by anybody anywhere, in my view. And he's talking about them, and he's talking about us. We all dispute a great deal about our nominal religion, but we are all unanimous about our practical one, of which I think you will admit that the ruling goddess may best generally be described as the goddess of getting on, or Britannia of the market. And all your great architectural works, it should be, are of course built to her. We have a new goddess. He has in the same lecture a wonderful evocation of the goddess who ruled ancient classical Greece, which he calls the goddess of wisdom. Wisdom was so important to them. And then the goddess of the Middle Ages, which he called the goddess of compassion, at a time when the church was so dominant. And then the goddess of the Renaissance. He was no fan of the Renaissance, as you've gathered, which he called the goddess of pleasure. And now finally we have the goddess of getting on, and all your great monuments are, of course, built to her. The skyline of Lower Manhattan as seen from the Jersey side. The skyline of Chicago as seen from a helicopter. The same skyline, don't you think? Just in a different place. The skyline of Los Angeles is seen from somewhere to the east. They're all the same. What is all this about? All of this is about the goddess of getting on, about making money, about value. We want our money's worth. What is our money's worth? To get people into the store and buy something. Any thought given to the people who make the store, create the store, nary a moment's. And so they are all dull, and we are all dulled. To remind you, another plate from the Seven Lamps of Architecture. Wonderful. These are all drawings of Ruskin's taken from various wonderful buildings and cathedrals on the continent during his trips to the continent. Look at how variant they are. They virtually dance off the page in different directions. They're all so fun. And the one on the lower left I particularly like. It's the acanthus leaves at the top of one of the pillars on the Basilica San Marco in Venice. But what Ruskin wants you to see, because he's drawn real acanthus leaves right next to it, He wants you to see how the one in the Basilica San Marco at the capital there is in fact a beautiful rendering of a real acanthus leaf. One of his principal arguments in all his art works is that all great art is based fundamentally on nature. But I want you to see something else. I want you to see that in the acanthus leaves on the pillar, they are almost identically, but they're all different. They're almost identical to the real leaves that have been drawn on the left. But what Ruskin wants us to see, what his illustration is intended to show, is that the fellow who did the capital on the Basilica San Marco had to go out and study and draw and make mistakes, and study and draw and make mistakes until he could render a real acanthus leaf in stone. That's creative. That's head and hand and heart. Fine art only appears when the hand, the head, and the heart go together. That is art. We miss it all the time. We miss it. Ruskin, in his life, got so fed up with the economics, the exploitive economics of the Industrial Revolution, and what he called the corrupt thing we call laissez-faire capitalism. He started his own organization called the Guild of St. George. And people, you can see St. George on the right there, slaying the dragon. St. George is the person who is a living human being who's slaying the horror of the Industrial Revolution and the time. And at the Guild of St. George, people would live, and they would create, and they would eat pure things, and they would not charge extra money, any more money than something was needed to pay for it properly. And the people worked on it properly, and he worked at the Guild of St. George. He invented it, and it still goes on today in England, and you can become members of it and be called a companion, as Ruskin called the people who worked, who lived and worked and believed in the message of the Guild of St. George in his own lifetime. It still is dedicated to doing good work, to make England's, what was once England's green and pleasant land, green and pleasant once again. And Ruskin's influence spawned an industry in his later years called Ruskin Lace. You see again the images of nature being repeated there. And here's another lovely example of Ruskin's lace, not like the one you just saw, because in life, everything is different and everything changes. And a company sprang up, and it was called Ruskin Pottery. And this is a piece of Ruskin Pottery, which a dear friend gave to me when I finished teaching a few years ago. And isn't it a lovely vase, done lovingly by loving hands, and it lives 100 and more years later. Morris understood all of this. Morris began his own way to get all of these things out into the world. Here's a Morris stained glass window in Boston, in the U.S. Burne-Jones, Edward Burne-Jones would have been the artist. But look at what a wonderful thing this one is, of all these different people, all painted by different folks, all different human beings, a veritable dance of human life. And he made wallpaper. We all know about Morris wallpaper. Well, here is a nice poster that we found indicating the different kinds of Morris wallpaper. But again, look how wonderful and different it all is. Morris's wonderful statement in the middle there, in the upper center part of the poster, says, "Have nothing in your houses that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful." Yeah. And now finally we come to Roycroft, and to this man. This is Elbert Hubbard, who is the founder of Roycroft. Hubbard himself was very dissatisfied with the industrial era. He lived in the second half of the 19th century with what was going on, believed in this, read Ruskin deeply, read Morris deeply, and decided in the mid-1890s that he was going to visit them both. They were both still alive. He made a trip to the continent, and when he came back, he wrote about his experiences with both of them and many others. A series of pamphlets that he called Little Journeys to the homes of great men and whomever. Anyway, he went to Ruskin's home, visited with Ruskin in 1895, came back, and was so impressed with what he saw with Ruskin and what Morris was doing, he decided to form his own community, which he called Roycroft, which still exists and which is sponsoring this wonderful series of talks. And here's the first building that Hubbard used when he was at Roycroft. And his influence here, this is a photo from 1905 of what it looked like. And he built into it his Morrisian influences, his Ruskinian influences. I love this. This is on one of the doors, carved on one of the doors as you enter the main part of the Roycroft Inn these days. The love, this is just perfect from what we've been talking about. The love you liberate in your work is the love you keep. I think that's just wonderful. But look at that door, look at the hinges. Fantastic. Yes, so back to the building for a moment. And inside on the bottom floor was the print shop where they made, where they created all the books that essentially brought so much money into Roycroft that they were able to survive. On the second floor, the books were sometimes bound and put together, women doing most of the work on those in those days. That was called the Morris room. And on the top floor, it looked like this, and it was called the Ruskin room. And there's a nice drawing of Ruskin on the right-hand side above the fireplace. So Hubbard writes a book. It's not so much of a book, it's like a large pamphlet. He calls it A Message to Garcia. He publishes it, it becomes incredibly famous. He becomes incredibly famous. Roycroft becomes incredibly famous, and money starts pouring in, and the whole ability of Roycroft to become the beginning of an arts and crafts movement in America has then taken off. Here's Albert and his second wife, Alice, in the print room, carrying on the traditions that we've been talking about. Here is the current print shop, or where the current print shop is housed on the campus. Very lovely. If you haven't been to Roycroft, you must come and have a walk around with us. We'll all show up and take a walk together. And in that print shop, you can find, as a result of the efforts of this man who is, has his hand on one of Elbert Hubbard's original printing presses, which he's been able to find in the neighborhood and install in the print shop. This is Joe Weber, Dr. Joe Weber. You're going to hear from Joe in our last Saturday, a few weeks away from now, about print in the modern era. And I just want to give you a sense, using Joe as an example, of the kind of work that can be done and is being done at Roycroft. Here are two of Joe's pamphlets done in the old style. Elbert Hubbard's own book on Ruskin, which records his time, his visit to Brantwood, Ruskin's home in the Lake District in England. And then one of my own talks called Why Ruskin is still so important to us today. And for a number of, here's Joe's wonderful design. You see Morris here, do you not? Wonderful design of this is the opening page of his pamphlet of my lecture. And on the left, one of my favorite drawings of Ruskin as a young man, the author of Modern Painters. All hand done, yeah? Well, all hand created, then printed and so on. Working for Joe for a number of years in the print shop was a young person called Nicole Witcher, and she did the hand illuminating for the books. Isn't this terrific? So you open the page and it's a delight because you've got vines dancing around the page. And on this page, this one, I like this one very much. She did this one in my Why Ruskin pamphlet. This is Nicole's drawing in the of the view out the window at Ruskin's home in Brantwood, looking over Coniston Water and the mountain there known as the Old Man of Coniston. A delight. You turn the page and it's a delight because the human being involved in creating this was given the liberty to do this and say to herself in this case, well, what will I put on this page? And came up with this idea. That is the heart of the arts and crafts. I told you I would come back to Morris's first page of The Nature of Gothic. This is Joe Weber's version of the Morris one, but look at it. Look at how glorious it is in full color. Look at that W. Look at all the wonderful vines on the side. Both Morris and Ruskin, I know, would be delighted with this. This is what the arts and crafts are all about. To my mind, Morris wrote, Ruskin's essay, The Nature of Gothic, in future days will be considered one of the very few necessary and inevitable utterances of the century. That's Ruskin's influence on the arts and crafts. Roycroft, also inside the main room of the Roycroft Inn, head, hand, and heart with the Roycroft symbol carved in the door. And just to give you a sense, you all don't really need to be told this, but maybe just a little bit more delight. Every year, the National Arts and Crafts Organization in the U.S. has a major event where people come together who are interested in the arts and crafts. I was asked to speak there 2 or 3 years ago and had a delightful time. And they house in this particular hotel, which is wonderful. It's an arts and crafts monument in itself, and they display their wares. And again, giving you a sense that the arts and crafts is really all across the United States and into Canada now in a very serious way. This is a chest of drawers created by someone for sale that you could get there. Here's a handcrafted metal lamp. Here are wonderful pieces of pottery. Here is another plaque that was hanging on the wall, head, hand, and heart. That's Ruskin's phrase, by the way. That's Ruskin's phrase, by the way. Just want to make sure that we remember that. And here's a lovely little book that Joe has also published at Roycroft called Hidden in Plain Sight by Edith Kitty Turgeon and Hugh McCalg. Anyway, it's a wonderful little book. You can get it from Joe if you're interested. But I love the metaphor of the title, that all of this is hidden in plain sight. It's always been true that every person is creative. It's always been true that if you let them be creative, they delight in their work. And sometimes they'll make bad work, and sometimes they'll make mediocre work, and sometimes they'll make great work. And it doesn't really matter because you're allowing them to make the work and grow in the doing of it. It's sort of like learning to draw an acanthus leaf. So, to bring it back together, we've come a long way in these last few minutes. Here's Swansea Copper Works. We began in the industrial era. The terrible pollution, the exploitation of the workers of the 19th century in England. We moved on to the wonderful, wonderful evocation of human creativity of Venice, and particularly St. Mark's Basilica. We came with Ruskin to Rouen and looked at that bad dog Spike in the upper left and cranky Uncle Pierre in the lower right, both of whom the sculptors of which delighted in doing the work that we did. We saw the town square in Ambeville, another collective human invention that delighted. And we saw at the very end, we spent a little bit of time at wonderful Roycroft. I love this from Sir Isaac Newton. He wrote, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Ruskin was the first giant. This is a bust of him at the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. William Morris took the ball and ran with it. Elbert Hubbard brought the arts and crafts to America, where it thrives today. These are the giants to which we owe our reverence, really, in the arts and crafts world. This is my favorite picture of Ruskin. It's a watercolor by Sir Hubert von Herkomer. It's at the National Portrait Gallery in London, and it doesn't display very often, but I was able to see it on one trip there by calling it out of wherever it is stored. I love the picture because, by the way, Ruskin always wore a blue cravat. He loved the color blue, and he had blue eyes, so they went together. But I love the picture. It was done in 1878 when Ruskin was beginning to doubt whether he had made any real difference in the world. You see that in his eyes. You see the world weariness in his eyes, but you see the great and the creative and the noble human being in his face as well. And he is a man Well, Robert Bolt, I think was his name, wrote a wonderful play about Sir Thomas More called A Man for All Seasons. That's one of my favorite plays. It's available on DVD, by the way, if you care to watch it. Ruskin was a man for all seasons. He worked in so many different areas, in art, in architecture, political economy, wrote about religion, wrote about poetry, wrote about, you name it, he wrote about it. Music, there's even a book on Ruskin and music. He loved Mozart, was no fan of Wagner. We can talk about that later. His favorite place in the world was the Chamonix Valley in the south of France, in the French Alps. And he would go there all the time. And he always said that Chamonix inspired him because of its beauty, inspired him to do his work. And this is a wonderful view of Mont Blanc, which is, as probably most of you know, the highest mountain in Europe, from a place that Ruskin loved deeply. And he would go there and he would climb up to this spot on the mountain looking over at Mont Blanc, and he would just look at it and study it and revel in it and absorb it. And I wanted to end with this. There was a rock there. There is a rock there. It's still there. It's a large glacial erratic, and it's just embedded deeply. Probably half or more of it is below the surface. And Ruskin used to go up to his rock, which is in a little pine alcove, as you could see, and he would lean his back against it, and sometimes he would sit on it, and he would look at the view from Ruskin's rock. In 1925, the town of Chamonix put a plaque on that glacial erratic, and it looked a little bit like this. And so I wanted to bring this to a close by sharing with you some of the last paragraph, really, that Ruskin ever wrote for public consumption in his primary work. He went back and wrote another chapter or so in his autobiography after this last trip to the continent. The last trip to the continent was in 1888. And one morning he was having trouble writing. It was a new edition of Modern Painters, all 5 volumes coming out. And he was charged with writing an epilogue to the new edition. And he wrote this in it, and it's one of the great little bits of Ruskin that one can always come back to for inspiration. And it contains in it, I believe, all of what we have been talking about today. So far from art's being immoral, in the ultimate power of it, nothing but art is moral. Life without industry is sin, and industry without art, brutality. This I say without reservation, that the knowledge of what is beautiful leads on, and is the first step to the knowledge of the things which are lovely and of good report, and that the laws, the life, and the joy of beauty in the material world of God are as eternal and sacred parts of his creation as in the world of spirits, virtue, and the world of angels, praise. So that is all I really have to share with you today. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Jim. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
We're going to open things up a little bit for questions. I know somebody had put in the chat, I don't know if this was a question or more just a comment in general. Diane wrote, by valuing only the aesthetic in Gothic architecture, are we narrowing ourselves?
Well, I don't know what others would say to that. I think Ruskin would immediately say, no, he was not doing that. He thought all creative work was wonderful. So going back to my acanthus leaves for a moment, the sculptor who put those into the pillar into the Capitol and the pillar at San Marco had to go out and essentially just study acanthus leaves or something else, study little children's faces, or something else, study a fox, or something else, study what a priest looks like, and all of these you can find on San Marco. So do go and do take the Stones of Venice with you, because he walks you everywhere around this wonderful building. But that's not my point. My point is that every step of the way is important for Ruskin. The beauty at the end is the icing on the cake. And if it's not beautiful at the end, well, at least you've grown in the doing of it. It's like, I don't know, I mean, I'll tell you a story. So the great, there was a great French short story writer whom very few people know these days, called Guy de Maupassant. And he wrote, oh, I don't know, hundreds of short stories. And for a time, he was thought to be the world's greatest writer of short stories. Anyway, he had a mentor. I don't remember the mentor's name at the moment. He had a mentor, and the mentor told him go out and write a short story about the coming of winter. So he did. So de Maupassant went out and wrote a story. He brought it to his mentor and he gave it to him, and the mentor took at it, looked at the title and threw it in the circular bin, threw it in the wastebasket. And de Maupassant was shocked. He said, the mentor said, "It's no good. I know it's no good. Why is it no good? It's your first effort. Try again." So de Maupassant went back and he wrote another one. And the mentor read the first two paragraphs and then threw it in the wastebasket. So my point in telling the story is that we all grow and some of us become great. Ruskin has numbers of places in his works where he says, you don't have to become Turner. You don't have to become the people who created the great cathedrals. You don't have to. You grow and you delight in the doing of it along the way. And if in the end, your piece of work, whatever you have, is, let's say, not as great as somebody else's, doesn't matter. You were allowed to do it and you used your own force to do it. So it's not just the beauty at the end, because not everybody's capable of doing that. And it's whatever, all of these things are valuable. All of these things are valuable along the way. Ruskin never had any, last part of this comment, Ruskin never had any notion that the people who worked on the great cathedrals or wherever they worked in the Middle Ages would become great artists. That was not the objective. The objective was to use your powers, your skill, your intellect, your head, your hand, your heart, to create something that you yourself did, and that was where the growth was.
And another question from Tim, is there any known influence of Ruskin on William Price?
There may be, but I don't know it. I really don't know anything about that, so I can't answer. I'd like to know about William Price, but I don't.
I don't know if there's any other questions. If anybody would like, here comes one from Michael. Does someone have an email for Joe Weber? I can send you that email. So William Galloway said, a similar quote to the inscription you showed on, and the quote is, "On the walls and towers of this your fair city, there is not an ornament of which the first origin may not be traced back to the thoughts of men who died 2,000 years ago. Whom will you be governing by your thoughts 2,000 years hence? Think of it and you will find that so far from art being immoral, little else except art is moral. That life without industry is guilt and industry without art is brutality. And for the words good and wicked used of men, you may almost substitute the words maker and destroyer."
So that's really interesting. I mean, as you heard from my quote a moment ago, that's a direct lift from Ruskin. I don't know whether Ruskin is acknowledged in the quote, but you know, Ruskin never would have been very parochial about his own work. He always said people can use whatever they like. The idea, the basic idea is to get the ideas out, to get people to understand the principles.
And William said he's taking that from an Oxford lecture by John Ruskin.
Yeah, okay, that's good, because that's where it came from.
Yeah. And that is carved in one of the walls or one of the doors on the chapel in Roycroft as well.
Is it?
Yes.
Oh, I haven't seen that. I'll have to do that.
I got a question. After the pandemic is over, when is your next tour to Venice?
Well, we have in mind two. I work with a wonderful British Ruskinian by the name of Nick Friend on these. And we just did one last year, actually, with some of the people who are online today. We took them around to the principal Ruskin sites in England and had a wonderful time. We had a wonderful group of people. So Nick and I have thought that we have two more in our imagination. if we ever get past where we are these days and Americans can go to Europe again. In any event, the first one would be Ruskin's France. And we would go to Amiens, we would go to Ambeville, we would go to Rouen, we would go, of course, to Paris for a little while, we would go to Lyon, we would go up into the French Alps and spend a lot of time in Chamonix and the area around there. I can't tell you, if you go on the tour, that you'll see that, but I can't tell you how wonderful that part of the world was. Ruskin was absolutely right about it being one of the most spectacular things in the world. You can spend an enormous amount of time there. So that's one trip that Nick and I have in mind. We were almost ready. We were booking it, in fact, when shutdown came in late March. And so it's on tap for whenever we can go again. And then the second one would be northern Italy. We would probably go various sites in Tuscany, including Florence, of course, including Pisa, etc. And then we would, Milan, because there's lots of Ruskin stuff there. And then we would end it with days and days at Venice, and it would be fabulous. So we have those two on tap. If you want to be notified about these when they do in fact materialize again, send Alan your name and email, and he can forward them on to me, because we're happy to have anybody on them who's got the interest.
A question from Peter Burnham. Why has so much modern architecture seemed to have lost its way? I don't think it's
the short answer, Peter, is money.
In some ways.
I mean, you know, remember the quote I shared about the goddess of getting on. What Ruskin hated about the Industrial Revolution was that everybody wanted to be rich. He has a line in Unto This Last where he talks about modernity, where everybody has this rage to be rich. They all want to have more than they need so they can buy and consume more than they need. And they want to be known for being rich. They don't want to be known for conquering cancer or finding the whatever else it is, the hidden tombs of somebody. They don't want to be known for what we would consider to be noble things, as once people did. They want to be rich. And so an example I frequently use when I get my students to think about this is that what do you want? What do you want in your life? And they all want to get 3 cars and have big screen TVs and have 2 homes, preferably one in a cool place in the summer, and they all want to die in Florida, which they're doing these days. Mm-hmm. But see, that's it's money. Yeah. Life is not about money. Everybody needs money. Everybody has to have a certain amount of money to live decently, but it's really about money. And it's about needing more than you need. We can all live decent lives on, there's been studies done on this. I mean, I don't know what the figure is. Let's say $75,000 a year. I have no idea whether that's accurate or whether you agree with me or not, but let's say that would be enough money. And then you can do what you want. You can travel, you can eat well, you can go see your friends, you can go to a restaurant every now and then, but you don't need 10 million a year or 20 million a year. And the very seeking after that level of riches puts somebody at a disadvantage. He has another passage in Unto This Last. See, you get me going on this, I'll go a long time. He has another passage in Unto This Last where he says, "The dollar in my pocket is not in yours." It's a beautiful phrase. Because if I got it, you don't. And if there's $100 to go around and I got 86 of them, guess what? Everybody else gets 14 of them and has to share them as best they can, and they often can't share them very well. So the short answer was money, but I didn't give you the short answer.
Thank you very much. I love the expression ruling goddess that you mentioned in talking about the famous traffic lecture.
Yeah.
I thought to myself, what is our ruling goddess today? You're right to say that to a considerable and tragic extent it is still money, but it's also the motor car. So much is destroyed on account of the motor car, and it appears that our temples are now called supermarkets. Why has our culture become devalued in this way? I just can't understand it. And we have as much need of Ruskin today, surely, as we had in the 1870s and 80s. I just want to say, Ruskin was a master at saying things beautifully and powerfully and with strength. And you're an absolute master at putting them together in a way that carries conviction and inspires us. So thank you so very, very much for that.
Very kind.
Two chaps listening in London.
Thank you, very kind. Anybody else? Well, it's like the end of a class, you know. It's like the end of a class. Any questions? And sometimes there aren't very many. That's okay. It was great. I enjoyed it very much. The weird thing, I was talking with Alan earlier, the weird thing about Zooming is that I can't feel you. You know, when you're in a real room, a classroom, you feel your audience. And you say something that you think is funny and they laugh, or they don't, as the case may be. But you can't feel people in a Zoom thing very well. And that's, I'm getting used to it, but I can't say I love it as well.
And if people do think of any questions throughout the week, feel free to pass them along to me. I'll be happy to pass them along to Jim, and and we can even take a little time next week to ask those questions if you'd like.
Thank you so much for your patience. I am delighted that you have signed up for this wonderful conference. Next week we have Peter Berman, who just asked the question from London a moment ago. He's going to be talking about Ruskin's influence on the arts and crafts in Scotland largely. Anyway, you're going to have a wonderful talk then. And then after that, we have a number of people who are active at Roycroft these days, who are going to be telling you much more about arts and crafts in Roycroft and arts and crafts generally, on talking on photography, talking on printing, talking about drawing. It's going to be great. So next week, I'll be in the audience. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week.